The world had shrunk down to the taste of dust and the weight of the pack on my back. That's the first thing I remember, really, about the retreat through Normandy. Not the big picture, not some grand strategy hell. We didn't have a clue about any of that. For us, it was just the next hedgerow, the next ditch, the next stretch of road that might have a sniper waiting at the end of it. We weren't an army anymore, not really. We were just a bunch of scared kids, a broken unit, falling back through a countryside that seemed to watch us with quiet hostility. The fields were green, a lush, impossible green that didn't care about our war, and the sun beat down on us like we were insects under a magnifying glass. Thirst was a constant, gnawing animal in your throat. Your canteen was empty more often than not, and the water you did find tasted like warm metal and the canvas of the canteen itself. We were more animal than soldier by then, driven by base instincts. Find water, find cover, keep moving. Your buddies' faces were just smudges of dirt and exhaustion, eyes hollowed out from too many nights of listening for the sound of artillery getting closer. You'd hear a twig snap or a cow lowing in the distance, and your whole body would go rigid, your heart hammering against your ribs like it wanted out. We'd been pushed back for days, maybe weeks. Time got funny like that, stretching and compressing until all you had was a collection of bad moments strung together. I remember the sound of our boots on the gravel, a dry, scraping sound that seemed to announce our presence to the whole world. And the smell, God, the smell. It was a mix of your own sour sweat, the damp wool of your uniform, cordite from the last firefight, and underneath it all, the sweet, rotten smell of the countryside, of manure and blooming things. It was a smell that should have been peaceful, but it just made everything feel more wrong. We'd been leapfrogging from one patch of cover to the next, our sergeant, a tough old bird from Kentucky named Miller, just pointing with a grimy hand, and we'd go, no questions asked. He'd bought it 2 days before, a stray mortar round that left nothing but a crater and a scrap of his jacket. After that, it was every man for himself, just a loose collection of ghosts drifting westward. That's when I saw it, up on a little rise, nestled in a grove of trees like something from a painting back home, a lone farmhouse. It was stone and timber with a slate roof that sagged in the middle. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. A sanctuary. That was the first thought. A place to get a mouthful of water that didn't taste like war, maybe even to sit down for a minute without fearing a bullet in the back. But the second thought was colder, sharper. A trap. It could be empty. It could be full of civilians who wanted nothing to do with us. Or it could be a German observation post, just waiting for a few dumb, thirsty Americans to wander into the yard. We crouched in the ditch, maybe 5 of us left, debating in hushed, cracked voices. "I'm telling you it's a bad idea," whispered a kid named Petey, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his rifle. "We should skirt around it, stick to the woods." But my thirst won out. The image of a cool, dark well in that farmyard was too powerful. "I'm going," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I can't take it anymore. I'll be quick." I didn't wait for an argument. I just pushed myself up and started moving, keeping low, using the hedgerow as cover. Every step was an agony of anticipation. I expected the crack of a rifle, the shout in a language I didn't understand. But there was nothing, just the buzz of insects and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I made it to the edge of the property, my eyes fixed on the barn, a large, weathered structure that seemed safer than the house itself. That's when it happened. There was no warning, no shout, just a searing, white-hot pain that exploded in my leg. It wasn't like the movies, where you get shot and you keep running. This was a sledgehammer blow that dropped me like a sack of potatoes. I didn't even hear the shot at first. The pain was so all-consuming it swallowed all other sound. Then it came, a flat, single crack echoing across the fields. I was down, lying in the dirt at the edge of a beat field, the green leaves waving above me like they were marking my pain. I tried to crawl, dragging myself through the dirt, my leg a useless, burning weight. I could feel the warm blood soaking through my pant leg, sticky and thick. My rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the fall. All I could think about was the barn. It was maybe 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Each inch was a victory, each pull with my arms a monumental effort. The world narrowed to the dirt in front of my face, the smell of wet earth and my own blood. I left a trail, a smeared, dark path through the field. I knew it. Anyone following would see it plain as day. But what choice did I have? Stay and die in the open, or die trying to reach some semblance of cover. I remember a strange detachment washing over me. The pain was still there, a raging fire in my thigh, but the fear began to recede. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. Not in some heroic charge, but crawling through a field in a country I couldn't even point to on a map a year ago. I thought about my mother's kitchen, the smell of apple pie, and I felt a sadness so profound it was almost peaceful. I must have passed out from the pain or the blood loss, because the next thing I knew, I was in the cool, dark gloom of the barn. The air was thick with the smell of hay, old wood, and animals. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through the cracks in the walls. I was lying on a pile of rough burlap sacks, and my leg in my leg was wrapped in a clean, white cloth. The pain was still a dull, throbbing ache, but the bleeding had stopped. And standing over me was an old man. He was thin, with a face like weathered leather and deep-set eyes that held no expression I could read. He wasn't saying a word. He just held a tin cup of water to my lips. I drank greedily, the water the most beautiful thing I'd ever tasted. It was cool and clean, and it washed the dust and the fear from my throat. I tried to speak, to say something, to thank him, to ask him why, but all that came out was a croak. He just shook his head slowly, a gesture that said everything. Be quiet, save your strength. He was a French civilian. I was an enemy soldier. And yet there he was, tending to me. It made no sense. None of this war made any sense anymore. I must have drifted off again, because the next thing I was aware of was the sound of voices. Not the scattered, nervous voices of my buddies, but sharp, confident voices speaking German. My blood ran cold. It was a different kind of cold than the fear of combat. This was the ice-cold dread of being hunted. I could hear boots on the cobblestones outside, the sound of a door being kicked open. They were in the house. I could hear the shouts, the demands, the heavy tread of jackboots on the floor above. The old man's wife, a woman with a face etched with a lifetime of work and worry, appeared at the barn. Her eyes were wide, not with anger at me, but with a pure, primal fear that was greater than anything I'd felt. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed me under the arms, this small, wiry woman, and with a strength I wouldn't have believed, she half-dragged, half-shoved me across the dirt floor to a corner of the barn. She pulled aside a stack of empty crates to reveal a trapdoor, yanked it open, and practically threw me down into the darkness below. I landed hard on a dirt floor, the impact sending a fresh wave of agony through my leg. She shoved the crates back into place above me, and I was plunged into absolute blackness. I could hear everything. The voices were muffled but clear. They were SS. I could tell by the tone, the arrogance in their speech. They were shouting at the old man and his wife, demanding to know if they had seen any American soldiers. I heard the word verdammt, damned, and the sound of something being overturned. I held my breath, pressing my face into the cool dirt of the root cellar. I could smell potatoes and turnips, the damp, earthy smell of a place meant to preserve life, now hiding it. I was the cause of this. These people, who had shown me a kindness I didn't deserve, were in mortal danger because of me. A German soldier, their supposed liberator, was hiding in their cellar while other Germans threatened them. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I listened to the threats, the stomping of boots, and I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to since basic training. I didn't pray for myself. I prayed for them, for that old man and his wife. Let them be safe. Let them tell the SS anything. Just let them live. After what felt like an eternity, the voices faded. I heard the sound of a motorcycle engine starting up, then another, and then silence. I stayed in that blackness for a long time, not daring to move, not trusting the quiet. Then slowly the trapdoor opened. A sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness. It was the old man. He climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't say anything at first. He just helped me back up into the barn and onto the burlap sacks. His hands were rough but gentle. His wife stood by the door watching the road, her body tense. Finally, the old man spoke, his voice a low whisper. He knew a little English, just a few words. They are. Not all the same, you know, he said, gesturing vaguely towards the road where the patrol had gone. He said it with a sadness that went deeper than the war. It was a sadness for his country, for all of us caught up in this madness. Later, as night fell, they brought me into the house. It was a risk, but it was colder now, and I was shivering. The main room was small, with a large fireplace and simple, sturdy furniture. They sat me at a rough-hewn wooden table. The woman placed a piece of dark bread and a small wedge of cheese in front of me. It was their food. You could see it in the sparseness of their pantry, in the careful way they handled it. That bread and cheese, I can still taste it if I think hard enough. It didn't taste like food. It tasted like pure humanity. It was the best meal I ever had in my life. We ate in silence, the three of us. There were no words that could bridge the gap between us. I was a boy from Ohio who'd been taught to kill the enemy. They were a French couple who had seen their country occupied for years. And yet, in that quiet farmhouse with the curtains drawn tight, we were just three people. The war, the uniforms, the flags, it all fell away. We were just hiding from the same terror. The old man lit a pipe, the smell of the tobacco sweet and familiar. He didn't offer me any, but he didn't exclude me either. We just sat there, listening to the wind outside, jumping at every little noise. That long, silent night was a truce more profound than any signed by generals. There was no me, the American, and them, the French. There was no enemy. There was just the shared understanding of fear and the quiet, astonishing courage of ordinary people who decided that compassion was a more powerful weapon than hate. When I finally closed my eyes, the pain in my leg was just a dull ache. The greater pain, the one I carried from all I'd seen and done, felt quieter. Not gone, but soothed by an act of grace I would never, for the rest of my days, be able to explain. I was captured by regular German troops a week later, and they treated me fairly, just as the old man said they would. But I never saw that farmhouse again. I never learned their names. They're probably long gone now. But what they did that day, that stayed with me. In all the chaos, in all the loss, that single, quiet act of defiance against the darkness is the thing that reminds me what we were really fighting for. It wasn't about borders or ideologies. It was about preserving that tiny, stubborn flicker of humanity that refuses to be extinguished, even in the deepest night. You never forget the smell of a field hospital, not if you live to be 100. It starts with the coppery tang of blood, so thick in the air you can almost taste it on your tongue like you de-licked a penny. Then there's the sweet, sickly smell of torn-up flesh, a smell that gets right up your nose and stays there. And underneath it all, the constant scent of fierce-wet and dirt and cordite. That little stone church in some French village whose name I can't even recall now, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, but by the time my unit set up shop, it was just another circle of hell. The stained glass windows were all blown out, just jagged teeth of colored glass left in the frames, and the cold night air mixed with the warmth of all those bleeding bodies. We worked by the light of a couple of kerosene lanterns that threw long, dancing shadows up the walls, making the statues of saints look like they were flinching from the carnage. Me and the other medics, we were just kids, most of us, but we moved like old men, weighed down by the exhaustion and the sheer volume of it all. The wounded just kept coming, a river of misery in grey German uniforms and the green of our own boys. The orderlies would bring them in on stretchers, or sometimes they'd just stumble in on their own, holding their guts in with their hands, their eyes wide with a kind of shocked confusion. My job, our first job, was triage. It's a fancy word for a horrible thing. It means you have to play God. You walk down the line and you make the choice. This one gets immediate surgery, this one can wait, and this one gets set aside with the last of the morphine. You look into a boy's eyes, he can't be more than 18, and you see the hope in them when you kneel down, and then you see that hope die when you just press the syringe into his arm and whisper something useless like, "Easy now, son." You're not saving him, you're just making his exit a little less painful. That's the grim calculus they never teach you in training. Who gets the last dose? The sergeant with the belly wound who's screaming for his mother, or the private with half his face gone who's too far gone to even make a sound. You make the choice, you mark their forehead with a grease pencil, and you move on. Your hands get slick with blood, your uniform stiff with it. You learn to tune out the moans and the prayers, because if you listen too close, you'll go crazy. You just focus on the task, on the next bandage, the next tourniquet. You think about stupid things, like the taste of a cold beer or your mom's apple pie, anything to keep from thinking about the boy you just sent to the quiet corner to die. It was during one of those long, endless nights, when my back was aching from hunching over, and the smell of death was so thick I could barely breathe, that the old farmer found me. He was a grizzled-looking fellow, face like a walnut, eyes that had seen too much. He didn't say a word, just crept in through a side door, his clothes smelling of soil and wood smoke. He grabbed my sleeve, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me away from a kid I was stitching up. He kept saying one word over and over in a desperate whisper, "Medicine, medicine." I knew enough French to understand that. He led me out of the church, into the biting cold of the night. The front wasn't far away. You could hear the rumble of artillery like distant thunder, and every now and then a flare would go up, painting the broken rooftops in a ghostly white light. I was scared. My first thought was that it was a trap, that some die-hard Krauts were waiting in an alley to grab a medic for interrogation. But the fear in this old man's eyes was real. He led me to a barn behind what was left of his farmhouse. The place smelled of hay and animals, a wholesome smell that felt like a memory from another life. He pointed up to the hayloft. I climbed the rickety ladder, my heart hammering against my ribs, not knowing what I'd find. And there he was, curled up in the hay, shivering so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. He was just a boy. Couldn't have been more than 16, 17. But he was wearing the black uniform that sent a chill down your spine colder than any winter wind, the SS. His face was pale and beaded with sweat, his eyes glassy with fever. A crude bandage was wrapped around his leg, dark and wet with seepage. The smell of infection hit me, that rotten sweet smell I'd become too familiar with. My training kicked in immediately. Medics don't see uniforms, we see patients, we see wounds. My first instinct was to get my scissors and cut away that filthy bandage, to clean the wound, to stop the poison from spreading. But then the fear crashed down on me. This wasn't just some regular German soldier. This was the enemy, the fanatics, the ones who'd shown no quarter. If I was found helping him, especially by my own guys, well, they wouldn't understand. They'd see the uniform, not the scared kid. They'd see a Nazi, and they'd see me as a traitor. I stood there frozen, my professional oath warring with my survival instinct. I looked at the farmer and his wife, who had appeared silently beside him. They didn't say anything. They just looked at me, their eyes pleading. And I looked back at the boy. He was mumbling in German, delirious. He called out for his mother, just like the boys in the church did. In that moment, the uniform didn't matter. The politics didn't matter. All that mattered was that a human being was dying in front of me, and I had the means to maybe stop it. I made my choice. I nodded to the farmers and got to work. From then on, my war had a secret. By day, I was still Medic Jenkins, patching up American boys, trying to save lives under the constant threat of shelling. But in stolen moments, during lulls in the fighting or under the cover of darkness, I'd slip away to that barn. It was a dangerous game. I started sneaking things from our own supplies, feeling a knot of guilt tighten in my stomach every time I did. A precious packet of sulfur powder, a roll of clean gauze, a few sulfur tablets. Our supplies were dwindling, and every bandage I took was one less for one of my own. I'd tell myself I was just balancing the scales, that saving one life was saving one life, no matter whose it was, but it was a hard argument to make when you saw your buddy bleeding out. Every time I approached that barn, my mouth would go dry. Every time I heard an American voice outside, or the sound of a Jeep engine, I'd freeze, my heart leaping into my throat. I'd picture the scene, being dragged out by my own comrades, accused of fraternizing with the enemy, of being a collaborator. The farmer and his wife, they were risking everything too. The Germans would have shot them for hiding one of their own who was a deserter, and the Americans might not have been much more forgiving. We had an unspoken agreement, the three of us. We never talked about it. We just did what needed doing. I'd climb into the loft, and the farmer's wife would have a basin of relatively clean water waiting. She'd stand watch by the door while I worked. I'd clean the boy's wound, the pus and corruption coming away on the gauze. I'd sprinkle the sulfur powder, hoping it would be enough to fight the gangrene. I'd give him the tablets, trying to get him to swallow them with a little water. He was in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd look at me with clear, terrified eyes, and I'd see him trying to understand why an American soldier was helping him. Other times he'd just drift away, back into his fever dreams. I didn't know his name. I didn't want to know. It was easier that way. He was just the kid, my secret patient. The days bled into one another. The fighting around the village intensified, then moved on, leaving us in a strange sort of quiet. Aid station got a little less hectic as the front line pushed east. And then one morning, after a particularly cold night, I slipped into the barn as usual. The farmer's wife was there, and she didn't need to stand watch anymore. She just pointed up to the loft with a small, almost imperceptible smile. I climbed up. The boy was awake. His eyes were clear, no longer clouded with fever. He was propped up on some hay, and he was sipping water from a cup held in his own trembling hand. He looked at me, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger, just a profound, exhausted gratitude. And something else, maybe a shared understanding of the absurd nightmare we were both trapped in. He nodded slowly, a gesture that said everything. I nodded back. Then the farmer's wife came up the ladder. She didn't look at him. She just came over to me and took my hand. Her hands were rough and calloused from a life of hard work, but her grip was gentle. She squeezed my hand just once, and her eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. That squeeze said more than any speech could have. It said thank you. It said we did a good thing. It said we are all just people. I walked out of that barn and stood in the weak morning sun. The war was still going on. Men were still dying a few miles away. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. I hadn't won a battle, I hadn't taken a hill, but I had saved a life. Not an enemy, not a German, not an SS soldier. A life, a boy's life. And in the midst of all that death and destruction, that felt like the only victory that mattered. It was a small, silent victory, one that wouldn't make the history books, but it was mine. And it's the one thing from that whole God-forsaken war that I've never regretted, not for a single second. 3 years. You don't really understand what 3 years is until you've spent it walking across Europe with a rifle in your hands and the taste of other men's mud in your mouth. It does something to you, a slow wearing down, like water on a stone, only the water is cordite and freezing rain, and the sight of a body you were just laughing, with now lying in a way that bodies just don't lie unless they're empty. You start out full of fire and ideas about good and evil, but the fire goes out, and the ideas get buried in some French field alongside the boys who believed. By 44, the only thing that was good was a hot meal, a dry pair of socks, and a stretch of quiet that lasted more than 10 minutes. The only thing that was evil was whatever was on the other end of a muzzle flash. A German wasn't a man with a family and a life before all this. A German was a grey-green uniform, a coal scuttle helmet, a stutter of MG-42 fire that kept you pinned in a ditch. He was the enemy, plain and simple, and the only rule that made any sense was the rule of survival. He kills you, or you kill him first. That's the cynicism that wraps around your heart like a crust of old dirt, and you wear it like a second skin, because it's the only thing that keeps you from going crazy when another letter from home arrives for a kid who's already been shipped back in a mattress cover. That's the man I was that afternoon, leading a squad of green replacements into another nameless village on the map, a smudge of stone and fear tucked into the Norman hedgerows. The air was thick, with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, and the only sound was the cautious crunch of our own boots on the gravel. We moved like cats, every sense screaming, because a quiet village was a dead village, and dead villages were usually bristling with snipers or wired with booby traps that could turn a man into pink mist. I could feel the tension in the boys behind me, these kids who still had the clean, scared faces of the folks back home. They hadn't learned the numbness yet. They hadn't seen what a Panzerfaust does to a Sherman's crew. I was the old man, the veteran, the one whose job it was to keep Em alive with my hardened heart and my simple, brutal rules. We cleared house after house, kicking indoors, our hearts hammering against our ribs, only to find emptiness or the wide, terrified eyes of a few civilians too old or too sick to flee. It was routine, just another nasty chore in a long, nasty war. Then we came to the farm on the edge of the village. It wasn't anything special. A low stone building with a mossy tile roof, a chicken coop that was suspiciously quiet, and a barn whose big wooden doors were shut tight. Something felt off. My neck prickled. You get a sense for these things. It was too still. I signaled for the boys to take up positions, their rifles trained on the windows and the barn. My sergeant, Miller, a good man who'd been with me since Sicily, gave me a tight nod. His knuckles were white on his Thompson. I took a deep breath, the familiar mix of fear and anger rising in my throat like bile, and I slammed my boot into the farmhouse door just beside the latch. The wood splintered with a crack that echoed in the silent yard, and we burst into the single room, ready for a fight. But there was no fight. Just an old woman, sitting perfectly still at a rough-hewn wooden table. The room was dark, smelling of stale bread and wood ash. A single shaft of light from a dusty window cut across the table, illuminating the deep lines on her face. She didn't jump, didn't scream. She just looked up at us, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes old and tired, and full of fear. Not the panic-stricken fear we usually saw, but a deep, dreadful fear that she was trying desperately to master. We fanned out, checking the corners, the loft. The place was empty except for her. But my eyes, trained by 3 years of looking for things that were out of place, found it. A spot on the stone floor near the hearth. Dark, damp, not water. I nudged it with the toe of my boot and felt the slight stickiness. Blood, fresh. I looked from the spot to her face, and her eyes flickered down for just an instant, confirming everything. The fear in them intensified. There was someone else here. A wounded someone. My hardened resolve snapped into place. This was it. The enemy, hiding. Using this old woman as a shield. Rage, clean and hot, washed over me. This was the kind of dirty trick that got my men killed. I gestured to the blood spot, and then to the barn outside, my voice a low growl. "All right, Grandma, where is he?" She just stared, her lips a thin, pressed line. I got right in her face, the stink of my own sweat and gun oil heavy in the space between us. "We know he's in the barn. We'll flush him out. You want to get hurt protecting some bosh." I was past reason, back in that simple world of us and them. I turned to my men, ready to give the order to surround the barn and toss in a grenade to be sure. But then she moved. Slowly, she stood up. She was tiny, frail, her back bent. She didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, she planted her hands on the table, leaning forward with a quiet defiance that stopped me cold. Her eyes, those old, terrified eyes, were now fixed on mine with an intensity that was almost physical. She shook her head slowly. Then, with a trembling finger, she pointed to a small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. I hadn't even noticed it. It was a young man in a French army uniform, smiling, his whole life ahead of him. My French was lousy, picked up from a phrase card and a few too many nights in estaminets, but I understood her next words perfectly. They were simple, and they shattered my world. "Mon fils," she said, her voice cracking. "Prisonnier de guerre, en Allemagne. Un mir allemand l'nerit, my son, a prisoner of war in Germany. A German mother feeds him." Time stopped. The words hung in the dusty air, simple, undeniable. They weren't about armies or ideologies or the bitter calculus of survival. They were about a son, her son, and a mother somewhere in Germany who was keeping him alive. It was a circuit completed, a connection made that bypassed 3 years of hardened scar tissue and went straight to the place where I remembered I was a son, too. I thought of my own ma, back in Ohio. Her face creased with worry every time the telegraph boy rode down our street. I thought of the letters she sent, full of news about the neighbors, and always, a chocolate bar tucked inside, a little taste of home she'd saved her rations for. And in that instant, the German soldier in the barn ceased to be the enemy. He was just a boy, some other mother's son, scared and bleeding, hiding in a dark barn thousands of miles from home. The gray-green uniform was just a costume. Underneath it was a kid who probably dreamed of his own mother's cooking, who maybe had a girl waiting for him, who was just as terrified and desperate to survive as I was. The entire edifice of my cynicism, the wall I'd spent 3 years building brick by bloody brick, crumbled into dust right there in that quiet farmhouse kitchen. I looked at my men. They were watching me, waiting for the order. They saw the blood. They knew the drill. Their faces were set, ready for action, trusting their veteran sergeant to do what needed to be done. I could feel the weight of that expectation, the weight of my own rage, the weight of every friend I'd lost. It was a heavy, familiar burden. But the old woman's words had placed a new weight on the other side of the scale, a weight so profound and human it made the first one feel cheap and hollow. Mercy. I looked from her defiant, grief-stricken face to the young, uncertain faces of my own men. I had a choice. I could follow the rule of survival, the rule that had kept me alive, and lead my men into a fight that would almost certainly end with another dead boy, and for what? Or I could betray all of that. I could choose mercy. I turned away from the old woman, my mind racing. I walked out into the farmyard, the bright sunlight a shock after the dark interior. I could feel Miller's eyes on me. "Sarge," he asked, his voice low. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of hay and dung and the metallic hint of impending rain. I made my choice. I raised my voice, making sure the men and probably the boy in the barn could hear me. All right, listen up. He's not in the house. He must have hobbled off into the woods. Miller, take Jenkins and Carlson, sweep the tree line to the east. The rest of you with me. We'll check the western edge. Move out. I barked the orders with an authority I didn't feel, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a lie, a deliberate, calculated lie. I was leading my men away from the barn, giving the wounded German a chance, giving the old woman's act of courage meaning. As we moved off, the crunch of our boots on the gravel sounding like a death knell to my old way of thinking, I didn't look back at the barn. I couldn't. I felt the weight of that decision settle on my shoulders, heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. It was a betrayal of my training, of the rage that had fueled me for so long. I was risking the trust of my men, my own standing, everything. But with every step away from that farm, a strange feeling began to grow in my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was something closer to being human again. That old French woman, with her quiet defiance and her simple, heartbreaking logic, had done what years of combat, death, and loss could not. She had reminded me that mercy wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was the one thing the war couldn't touch, the one thing that separated us from the cruelty we were fighting against. She taught this hardened veteran, in a single, silent moment in a dusty farmyard, what mercy really meant. And I carried that lesson with me for the rest of the war, and for every day of the long, quiet life that followed. You want to know about the war? Hell, everyone wants to know about the war, the big picture, the generals, the beaches, the tanks. But that's not the war I remember. The war I remember was quiet. It was the war of static and silence, of a dusty attic and a knot in your gut that never really went away. My war was fought with headphones clamped over my ears, listening to the ghosts in the ether, translating their coded whispers into nightmares. They called me a radio operator, a Sparks. But most of the time I felt less like a soldier and more like an eavesdropper on the apocalypse. This one story, though, this is the one that keeps me up some nights, not from the fear, but from the, well, you'll see. It was in Normandy after the breakout, but the area was still messy, full of pockets of Germans who didn't get the memo that they'd lost. Our unit had set up a temporary command post in this French farmhouse, a big, old place that smelled of damp stone and generations of boiled potatoes. My post was the attic, always the attic. You get used to the isolation after a while, the feeling of being the unit's ghost. Down below, you'd hear the low murmur of the officers planning, the clatter of mess tins, the occasional burst of laughter that felt like it came from another world. Up there, it was just me, my BC-1000 radio set, the tang of sulfur from the batteries, and the endless hissing static. To keep from going nuts, I'd watch the family through the small, grimy window. The old farmer, Marcel, with a face like a weathered map, and his wife, Elise, who moved with a quiet, bird-like grace. They were scared. You could see it in the way they always paused to listen, their eyes darting towards the lane at any unfamiliar sound. They'd lost so much already, you could feel the weight of it in the house. And then there was the barn. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a dilapidated old structure. But you develop an eye for patterns in this job. Marcel would go in there 3-4 times a day, carrying a pail that was too small to be for livestock, or a basket with a cloth over it. It wasn't the rhythm of farming, it was the rhythm of caring, of hiding. We all knew it, I think, the guys downstairs. There was an unspoken rule. You didn't ask. In a war, some secrets are better left in the shadows. We had our own jobs to do. My job was to listen. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt no different from any other, I heard it. The signal was crisp SS encryption, a higher-grade cipher than the regular Wehrmacht used. It always sent a chill down my spine, those SS messages. They were colder, more final. It took me a good 20 minutes to break it, my pencil scratching furiously on the pad, the code revealing itself like a poison unfolding. The message was brief and brutal. An Einsatzkommando unit was being dispatched to sweep our sector. Their orders: such an unzersteren Elefeinduberest und collaboratura. Search and destroy all enemy remnants and collaborators. Standard, nasty stuff. But then came the coordinates. My blood turned to ice water. I checked them twice, my fingers trembling as I triangulated them on my map. The pencil tip landed right on top of our farmhouse. And then the description: large stone farmhouse, red tile roof, notable oak tree in western yard. That was our oak tree. I was looking right at it. The world just shrank to the size of that map grid. The static in my headphones became a roaring in my ears. I was privy to the most dangerous secret of all: the exact time and place of my own death and the death of everyone in the house below. Protocol was clear. Immediate transmission to command. Report the threat, request support or orders to evacuate. That's what a good soldier does. But evacuate to where? The fields were open, we'd be spotted in minutes. And support, they were hours away. Reporting it would just be a formality, a final entry in a logbook. And what about Marcel and Elise? That quiet, fearful couple who'd shared their home, their precious, hoarded food. Collaborators, the word echoed in my head. Was that what they were? Hiding some downed Allied airmen, a resistance fighter? It didn't matter. The SS wouldn't ask questions. They'd line everyone up against that very stone wall, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. The weight of that knowledge was a physical thing crushing my chest. I was 22 years old, and in that moment I felt 1,000. The decision wasn't some heroic, clear-cut thing. It was a desperate, selfish, human scramble. I didn't want to die in a French attic for following an order that meant nothing. And I didn't want those two old people to die for an act of mercy. So I broke. I ripped the headphones off, the cord snagging and nearly pulling the set off the crate. I stumbled to the attic hatch, my legs like rubber, and clambered down the ladder, ignoring the protocol that said I never leave my post. I burst into the main room where the captain was studying a map with a couple of sergeants. They all looked up, startled. "Captain," I said, my voice sounding thin and strange. "We have to go, now." I told them about the message, the coordinates. I lied. I said the SS was sweeping the area, but that they were concentrated a few miles east. I said we had a small window to bug out and avoid contact. It was a gamble, a huge one. If they checked my log, if they asked to see the decoded message. But the captain just swore a short, sharp curse. He trusted me. That was the worst part. He trusted his radio man. "All right, boys, you heard him. 5 minutes. Grab the essentials. We're moving." The room exploded into controlled chaos. As they scrambled, I grabbed Marcel's arm. He was standing by the hearth, his face pale. I pulled him aside, close, speaking low and fast. "The SS," I whispered. "They're coming here, specifically here. They know." The blood drained from his face. He didn't ask how I knew. He just looked at me, and in that look I saw a lifetime of fear condensed into a single moment. Then he turned to his wife, Elise. They didn't speak. Just a frantic, silent look passed between them, a whole conversation in a second. And then they moved. They rushed out the back door towards the barn. I followed them, my heart pounding a drumbeat against my ribs. The barn was dark, smelling of hay and old wood. In the farthest stall, under a pile of straw, was a trapdoor I never would have seen. Together, we heaved it open, revealing a steep earthen stairway into a hidden wine cellar. The air that wafted up was cool and damp. And then I saw him. It wasn't an Allied airman. Lying on a makeshift pallet was a young man, couldn't have been older than me, in the field-grey uniform of a German lieutenant. He was wounded, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages, his face slick with fever sweat. He looked up at us, his eyes wide with terror. For a split second the world stopped. The enemy, the man we were supposed to kill, and here we were, Marcel and Elise, trying to save him. The absurdity of it all hit me like a punch. But there was no time. The German boy, and he was just a boy, stared at me, an American soldier, and I saw no hatred in his eyes, just the same animal fear I felt in my own gut. We half-dragged, half-carried him down into the cellar. It was a small, cramped space, lined with dusty bottles. Elise brought down a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread. She touched the boy's forehead with a tenderness that transcended armies and flags. Marcel looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate plea. "You are not going?" he asked. I shook my head. "I have to stay to sell the story." I closed the trapdoor and we kicked straw back over it. By the time I got back to the house, the jeeps were loaded. The captain yelled, "Sparks, you ride with me. Let's move." I made my choice. "Sir," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "My set, the batteries are almost dead. If I try to move it now, we lose comms for hours. Let me stay, keep monitoring, I can hide. If it's clear, I can signal for pickup later. If not, well, you'll know." He looked at me, a long, hard look. It was a crazy risk, but comms were life. He gripped my shoulder. You're a brave kid. All right, hide well. We'll listen for your signal at 1800 hours. God be with you." And just like that, they were gone. The sound of the engines faded, and a silence descended on the farmhouse deeper than any I had ever known. I was alone. I dragged my radio set from the attic and set it up right on the rough wooden table in the main room in plain sight. I wanted them to see it. I poured myself a shaky glass of water from the pitcher, my hands trembling so badly the water slopped over the side. And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The sound came first, the distant growl of engines, then the crunch of tires on gravel. Two black Citroën traction Avant cars, the kind the Gestapo and SS loved, slid into the yard. Men in fieldgray with the dreaded lightning bolt runes on their collars spilled out, weapons held ready. Their leader, a Hauptsturmführer, was all sharp angles and cold eyes. He strode into the house without knocking. His eyes immediately landed on me, on my uniform, on my radio. "Amerikaner," he said, his voice flat. "A line, alone." I nodded, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I held up my hands. "Funker," I said, "radio operator." He gestured, and two of his men patted me down roughly. They found my sidearm, but nothing else. The Hauptsturmführer looked at my radio log, then back at me. "Your unit. Where are they?" This was it. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could see it through my shirt. I pointed vaguely east, towards the false location I'd given my captain. "They moved out an hour ago, towards St. Miriglais." I prayed my voice didn't betray the sheer, gut-wrenching terror I felt. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes like chips of ice. It felt like an eternity. He was looking for a twitch, a flicker of fear, a lie. I held my breath. Then he turned to one of his men. "Search the property, thoroughly." The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I heard them stomping through the rooms upstairs, opening cabinets, overturning furniture. I heard them in the barn, the sound of bayonets stabbing into hay bales. I stood there, trying to look like a defeated, abandoned soldier, while inside I was screaming. Every fiber of my being was screaming for them not to find that trapdoor, for the German boy not to cry out, for Marcel and Elise to remain perfectly silent in their tomb. The soldier who had searched the barn came back in, shaking his head. "Nichts, Herr Hauptsturmführer." Nothing. The officer's cold eyes swept over me one last time. He seemed almost disappointed. He smirked, a cruel little twist of his lips. "Your army leaves its men behind. A pity." With that, he turned and walked out. I watched from the doorway as the cars kicked up gravel and disappeared down the lane. I stood there until the sound of their engines completely faded, replaced by the chirping of birds that had been silent the whole time. My legs gave way and I slumped against the doorframe, trembling uncontrollably. A few minutes later, I heard the trapdoor open. Marcel emerged first, his face ashen. Then Elise, helping the young German lieutenant who leaned heavily on her. They stood there in the yard, the four of us, an impossible tableau, an American radio man, two French civilians, and a wounded German officer. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other. In that silence, something passed between us, a bond forged in a shared, terrible secret. It was a lie that had saved us, a deception that felt in that moment more truthful than any order or flag. The war didn't end that day. There were more battles, more static, more fear. But in that quiet French farmyard, with the dust settling and the birds singing again, the war, for a little while, just stopped. And all that was left was us, just people. You want to know what the war was really like? Not the newsreel version, not the stuff they print in the papers back home. Those reels showed you clean lines of men, a noble fight, good versus evil, plain as day. They showed you the enemy as these monstrous, helmeted automatons, less than human. I believed it too. We all did, us replacements. We were green as grass, full of fire and righteous anger, itching to get over there and show the world what we were made of. But let me tell you, the war I saw, the one that got inside my bones and stayed there. It wasn't black and white. It was all shades of grey, and sometimes, in the quietest moments, it was even a little bit of colour. It all started for me on a troop ship, the air thick with the smell of salt water, diesel, and the collective fear of 1,000 boys trying not to be sick. We joked about it, of course. Dark humour, that was the first language you learned. "Hey, if a U-boat gets us, at least we won't have to dig a foxhole," someone would say, and we'd all force a laugh that sounded more like a cough. My buddy Frank from Chicago spent most of the trip leaning over the railing, offering his breakfast to the Atlantic. He'd turn back to me, his face the color of old cheese, and say, "Kid, if I'd known it was gonna be like this, I'd have let the draft board find me hiding in my ma's root cellar." I was just a kid, barely 19, and my whole world had been a small town in Ohio where the biggest drama was who won the Friday night football game. I'd practiced with a wooden rifle in basic training, shot at painted targets, but holding the real thing, a cold, heavy M1 Garand that was different. It felt like it didn't belong in my hands. We landed not on some hellish beach like in the newsreels, but at a port that was just organized chaos. Noise was the first thing that hit you, our constant, grinding symphony of truck engines, shouted orders, the distant thump of artillery that was more felt in your chest than heard with your ears. The air tasted of dust and crushed stone and something else, something metallic and sour that I later learned was the smell of war itself. We were shoved into the back of a Deucing-Dahaf, the truck bouncing so hard on the rutted roads you felt your teeth might shake loose. We were replacements, fresh meat for the grinder. The veterans we met at the front lines, they looked at us with a kind of weary pity. Their eyes were old, set deep in grimy faces. They didn't talk about glory. They talked about dry socks, about hot chow, about the girl they left behind. They joked about near misses with a flat, empty tone that scared me more than any story of combat. One grizzled sergeant, a guy with a network of cracks around his eyes that looked like a road map of France, just looked at my clean, unlined face and said, "Try to keep your head down, kid. The heroes are all dead." That was my introduction. The neat and tidy war from the propaganda posters was gone, replaced by this muddy, confusing, terrifying reality where the only clear objective was to see the sun rise tomorrow. My black and white view was already starting to fog up around the edges. After a few weeks of this, of mud and misery, and the constant, low-grade terror that sits in your gut like a cold stone, my unit got pulled back for a brief rest, and I got what everyone called a soft job. Me and a couple of other guys were assigned to guard duty in a small French village a few miles behind the lines. It was a place that had been chewed up by the early fighting and then mostly left alone. The name doesn't matter. It was just a collection of battered stone houses, a shell of a church with its steeple knocked off, and a silence that was heavier than any artillery barrage. The people there, the civilians, they were just hollowed out. They moved through the rubble like ghosts, their eyes avoiding yours. They'd seen armies come and go, and we were just the latest uniform. We were supposed to be keeping an eye out for stragglers, sabotage, that kind of thing. Mostly, it was just boring. You'd stand your post, watch the mist roll in over the ragged fields, and try to forget the rumble from the front that was always there, a reminder that this peace was temporary. It was there, in that strange, quiet limbo, that everything changed. It was a damp afternoon, the kind where the chill gets right into your bones. I was on a patrol around the perimeter of the village, my boots squelching in the mud. The place was so quiet you could hear the crows arguing in the bare trees. That's when I saw this scrawny little dog, some kind of terrier mix, all ribs and matted fur. It darted out from behind a collapsed stone wall, looked at me with these scared eyes, and then trotted off towards a large, half-collapsed barn on the edge of a farmstead. I don't know why I followed it. Boredom, maybe. A need to see something other than rubble and weary faces. I pushed open the heavy, splintered door of the barn, the hinges groaning like a dying man. The air inside was thick and still, smelling of old hay, dust, and animal musk. Sunlight cut through the cracks in the walls in sharp, dusty beams. I saw the dog sniffing at a large stack of hay bales in the corner, and then I saw a boot. It was a German boot, the telltale shape, caked in dried mud. My heart just stopped. Then it started hammering against my ribs like it was trying to get out. All the training, all the fear, it just took over. In one fluid motion, I raised my rifle, the bolt action slick under my sweating palm. My finger curled around the trigger. "Hend Hark!" I yelled, my voice cracking, echoing in the quiet barn. The hay rustled, and a figure slowly, painfully sat up. It was a young man, maybe my age, maybe younger. His face was pale and gaunt, smeared with dirt. A crude, blood-stained bandage was wrapped around his head, covering one eye. His uniform jacket was ragged, and he was shivering. He didn't look like a monster. He looked terrified. He was just a kid, and he was helpless. My rifle was pointed right at his chest. I could see the rapid rise and fall of his breath. This was it. This was the enemy. This was the face I was supposed to hate. But all I felt was a confusing, nauseating wave of adrenaline. My mind was screaming the propaganda, but my eyes were seeing something else entirely. And then she was there. The Frenchwoman from the farmhouse, the one who always looked at us with that unreadable expression. She moved so quietly I hadn't heard her come in. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just walked right up to me, stepping between my rifle and the wounded boy. She placed her hands on the hot barrel of my gun, her chapped, work-roughened fingers gentle but firm. She looked me right in the eye, her own eyes a deep, calm brown, and she slowly, deliberately shook her head. "Nan," she said, her voice steady. "Nan." My whole body was trembling. I could have pushed her aside. I could have done my duty, but something in her gaze held me frozen. Just then her husband, the old farmer, came in, his face etched with panic. He held his hands up. "Nan, soldat, pas Nazi, deserteur." He knew a little English, and between his broken words and frantic gestures, the story spilled out. They had found this boy, this German soldier, stumbling through their field a week earlier, bleeding from a head wound. He was a deserter. He'd thrown down his rifle and run from his own unit. The farmer made a cutting motion across his throat. "SS," he hissed, his eyes wide with real fear. "SS, they find him, they kill him. And then us. Ils nous tuent aussi." They would kill them too, for the act of mercy, for hiding a deserter. And in that moment the entire war flipped upside down for me. The enemy wasn't just over the next hill. The true monsters, the ones this farmer and his wife were risking everything to hide from, were this boy's own people. I looked from their scared, determined faces back to the German kid in the hay. He was just staring at the ground, shivering. He wasn't a fanatical Nazi. He was a terrified kid, just like me. He probably had a mother waiting for him back in some village in Germany, praying for his return. He'd probably been fed the same kind of patriotic lies I had. He just wanted to go home. My rifle felt incredibly heavy. The urge to lower it was overwhelming. I slowly, carefully lowered the muzzle to point at the dirt floor. The Frenchwoman took her hands off the barrel, a flicker of relief in her eyes. The farmer nodded, a silent thank you. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I just backed out of the barn, into the grey afternoon light, my mind reeling. The neat categories of good and evil I'd carried with me from Ohio had just been blown to pieces. I walked back to my post in a daze. That night, lying on my bedroll in the billet, listening to the other guys snore, I couldn't sleep. The image of that kid's face, pale and scared, was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I thought about the farmer and his wife. They had nothing. They'd lost almost everything to this war. And yet they had everything's immense, quiet courage that I couldn't even comprehend. They were risking a firing squad for a boy who, by all rights, was supposed to be their enemy. What was my courage? Following orders, shooting at a faceless foe, that was easy compared to this. The next morning, when we were given our rations, I found I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots. I looked at the tin of stew, the hardtack biscuit, and I made a decision. It wasn't a grand, heroic decision. It was a quiet one, made in the pit of my stomach. I was going to become an accomplice. When no one was looking, I slipped away from the village square and made my way back to the barn. I didn't go inside. I just left the rations tucked behind a loose stone near the door, next to a small, half-empty bowl of water I guessed was for the dog. I did it again the next day, and the day after that. It became my secret mission, a tiny rebellion against the insanity of it all. I never saw the German boy again. I never spoke to the French couple about it. It was an understanding, a silent pact between us. A week later, we got our orders to move back up to the front. The war wasn't done with us. As we marched out of that village, I took one last look back at the battered farmhouse. The war would go on. There would be more fighting, more fear, more friends lost. But I had learned something in that quiet barn that would stay with me long after the guns fell silent. I learned that the enemy could wear your own face. I learned that compassion could be an act of defiance. And I learned that the greatest courage isn't always found in fighting, but sometimes in the quiet, terrifying act of refusing to. It was the most important lesson I ever learned, and I learned it not from a sergeant or a general, but from a poor French farmer, his brave wife, and a wounded boy who just wanted to go home.